to our second CATIA video. In this video we're going to cover saving your part, creating a spline and a rib, creating patterns out of your geometry, and also copying and pasting parts into your assembly. So let's get started. I'm just going to keep using this wheel that we created in the first video. And so first things first, I'm going to want to save this wheel. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to click on the share button and go to save. Now when I save the part here, what it's doing is it's uploading those changes into the collaborative space, and it's going to ask me for a password here. It won't always do this. It depends on how long it's been since you signed in. So that's going to go ahead and save. Now we have some other options with saving as well. So what I just did was save those changes to my part model in my collaborative space. But the other two options that we have here is also something called a local save. Now local save happens automatically, and essentially what it's doing is it's creating a temporary save file for your part on your computer, so that if something comes up, if CATIA shuts down, if you accidentally close out without saving, it's always going to keep those changes that you made in your last session. So if I were to go and close this and decide I needed to open it again, a little dialog box would pop up asking if I wanted to restore my last session, which would take me to where I left off with my model. This is very useful because it means that you can make changes to your part without worrying about all of them becoming final in your model until you've decided you want to keep them. The other option that we have here is exporting. And I bring this up now that I'm talking about saving because this is the best way to save a backup of your assembly. So if you're worried about some changes being saved to your collaborative space that you're going to want to undo, this is a great way to keep a copy of your model on your computer, just in case. This is also a great way that you can export your part to be used in another program like SolidWorks. Alright, so now that we have this saved, let's go ahead and start by making the spokes on this wheel. And we could do this with just a pad, but I want to make this a little bit more interesting. So we're going to create a rib here. So I'm going to come over here, and the first thing I want to do, I want to add another plane. For these ribs that I'm going to create, I don't want them coming directly out of the center, so I'm going to offset that a little bit. And 40 millimeters seems okay. So I'll take that, and then I'm going to select that plane. And we're going to create a sketch on that plane. Now, something to notice, I can still come off center with my sketch as well if I need to see it from a different angle. And if you get this all kind of messed up here, you can always set it back to being normal with the sketching plane with this button here. Alright, so let's make our profile. I'm going to do this with the Spline tool. And what the Spline tool does is it creates a curve through all of the points that you put in here. So I'm going to put in 3 points. Notice I can drag it off. And once I'm finished, I just hit escape. I'm going to create one on the other side. Now as I'm doing this, notice if I line it up with the axes, I get a little icon there and a blue dotted line that's showing that it's going to be constrained to always be in line with that arrow. And these points that I created have a little circle here that's showing that that constraint exists. Now as I bring this down and line it up with that point, you notice that that circle icon becomes filled in. That's showing that they're coincident, and if I leave the point there, it's going to be stuck, fixed to that point. I'm going to do the same thing over here, and I'm going to make sure my final point lines up as well. This is important because it's very common to create the final point to some profile that's just slightly offset from the end point on this curve. And if that happens, you're not going to be able to create any sort of solid feature out of it. So make sure that little icon shows up, showing that they're going to be coincident. I'm going to hit escape again. Alright, so let's go ahead and constrain these. I'm going to double click on this. I'm going to go from the point to the axes. We're going to make that 5 millimeters. Point to the axes. We're going to make that 5. Okay. Just point to the axes. Let's see, we're going to make that, sure, 18 seems good. Point to the axes, 18. Now notice I didn't have to constrain these points in the horizontal direction because I've already fixed them to be on this line. So that's fully constrained. I'm going to go ahead and exit Sketcher. Alright, and the next thing we need to create a rib, we need a path for it to follow. So I'm just going to draw this on the YZ plane here. And we're going to create another sketch. This will be another spline. Then I just go straight up. And I'm going to curve this off a little bit. Hit escape. Constrain these. Now this first one I'm just going to constrain so that it's in line with the sketch I created. There we go. Set that to be 0. And I'm going to create the distance between these 2 points. Now these are fixed to be on the vertical line, so the only measure possible is also vertical. Set that to be 60, but notice when I do this next one, I'm going to take this first point, this last one. It tries to find just the shortest distance and constrain it that way. I'm going to right click and force that to be a vertical measure. We're going to go 150. And let's do horizontal as well. We'll set that to be 55. Alright, that looks pretty good. So, I'm going to exit my sketch again. Let's get that over here. Alright, so now we're ready to create the rib. So we're going to activate the tool. We're going to give it the profile that it wants to follow, that sketch. Center curve is this line. And that shows us that rib going in. One thing to keep in mind here, notice I forced it to go all the way past the edge of the wheel. And the reason that I did that is I wanted to make sure that this side all meshed up. I'm going to go back and remove this extra material later. Alright, so that's using the spline tool and the rib tool. What we want to do now is we want to turn this into a circular pattern so I don't have to go through and draw all of the different spokes. So we're going to select the circular pattern button. It needs an object. Right now it automatically assumes I want the entire solid. I don't, I just want this rib. And I need a reference element. So it needs an axis to turn about. And I can actually just select this circular wall and it will use the axes. Alright, now there's a couple of different ways to define the spacing of these spokes. Notice over here I have instances and angular spacing. So I have 8 instances, creates a total of 8 spokes, spaced at 45 degrees. Now if I were to reduce this to 30, the spacing changes and it doesn't go all the way around. If I want to make sure the spokes go all the way around, then I can figure out what the angular spacing would need to be for 8 spokes, or I can actually come down here and just activate this complete crown tool, which just always spaces them automatically for me. So if I change this to be 7, hit preview, it'll space them for me. Alright, so now I have my very interesting looking spokes on this wheel. Alright, so let's come back to these little spikes that are sticking out the sides. We don't want those, so we need to figure out a way to get rid of them. And I could come through and I could remove this material myself, but what I actually want to do, I'm just going to reorder my tree here so that this groove that we cut comes after that pattern that we just set. In order to do that, I need to select the groove as well as the fillet and the chamfer, so I'm going to hold Shift and click on that chamfer. And then I can right click on those. I can go Selected Objects and Reorder. Alright, so now it just needs me to pick something that I want these features to come after. I'm going to select the circular pattern and hit OK. Now this is the important thing with reordering. Notice all of those features seem to have just disappeared. And all that means is that it's looking at a different object here in the tree. And I want to make sure that it's looking at the most recent object. So I'm going to right click on this last feature and say Define In-Work Object. We're going to say that that's the one that we've done most recently. If I select that, all of my features come back, and notice these little spikes disappear. Now, depending on how you drew your box when you did that groove, you might still have a little bit of material from them left over, and all you have to do is go back to the sketch you used for that groove and make that box a little bit bigger so that it removes the rest of that little spike. Alright, now we have that wheel. So that's the circular pattern tool. There's also a rectangular pattern tool, and I'm just going to show you guys how that works. So in this instance, I'll just grab the whole solid. I want to create a second instance. That seems a fine amount of spacing. The one thing that it needs right now is it needs a plane to define where it's going. So I'm just going to click this plane. If you want better control over where your duplicate goes, you might want to draw an additional line. I could draw a line on this plane, and then I can select the line as my reference element, and it will force it to move in that direction. But since I don't care too much about where it goes right now, I'm just going to use the plane. Hit OK, and now we have a duplicate of that part. One thing to keep in mind, however, if you're going to duplicate an entire part in this way, notice when I duplicated that, it's actually considering this whole object as part of the geometry that's defining this one part. So it's actually still thinking of both of these in our tree as one part. Now if you want to duplicate an entire part, rather than creating a rectangular pattern like this where they would be disconnected, I can actually come back to my original assembly, or the assembly containing this part. And there's two ways that I can do this. I can select an assembly pattern, select the part I want to duplicate, and find a reference element, which I'm just going to grab this plane, and it'll try to create a pattern. Now by default it assumes 2 in each direction. And if I just want 1, I can change that as well. Alright, and there I have a pattern of parts. So these have been defined as 2 separate parts. Notice this little yellow axis that showed up on this new part? All that means is that the set of planes for the new part, which is this one, is not lined up with the old part. By default, this set of planes would be right on top of each other for every part that we create. If it is moved to a different location, that's going to be shown here. So that's an assembly pattern. I'm going to undo that. Alright, so we've removed that second part. Now I can do the other mode here, which is simply to copy and paste this part. So I'm going to copy that. Make sure I have my assembly active, and I can paste into that assembly. And then it pops up this little orange thing here. It's actually called the robot in CATIA that lets me position that set of planes where I want it. Click anywhere else, and I've now created that second part. Now at this point I want to give a little bit of warning, and let me show you what I mean here. With any kind of pattern, including that inside a part or an assembly pattern or even copying and pasting, the new part or the new features are all going to be considered children to the original. So if I come here to the original and I'm back in the 3D shape here, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the pocket and the hole, again holding down Control or Shift in that case. And what I'm going to do is mirror these features. So I'm going to select them, select mirror, select a plane for them to be mirrored across, and hit OK. And notice when I did that, it changed those features over on this other part as well. And that can be very useful if you have a set of features that you want to all remain the same in all cases. Okay, so instead of doing that, what we want to do is actually export this part. Then we're going to import a copy back into the assembly that will then be seen as a separate part. So the first thing I'm going to do is just delete this the second one. I'm going to go ahead and hit no on that, which leaves us with just this one part. Now in order to export just this portion of my assembly, I need to right click on that part. Now in order to export just the part instead of the whole assembly, I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to come down to its name right here and say open a new app. And all it's going to do is open it in a separate window. And I can select it. I can make sure that it's saved. Alright, and then I can come down here and select export. Alright, now I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to put it on the desktop here. And let's just call this test wheel. Leave it in 3DXML. That's great. I'm going to hit OK. Alright, so that's going to export it to my desktop on my computer. And now, I don't need that tab anymore. Now I can come back to the overall assembly. And I can come up here to add. Make sure I have the assembly selected. Import. And we're going to look for that file. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to pull it out of my own desktop. Test wheel. There we go. And then the next thing I need to do, and this is really important, is make sure this box here is checked. This says as new. That's really the option that is going to force this to be a separate part. Select OK. And that's going to import it into my collaborative space here. So here we go. Alright, so this is the second part. You notice it's changed the name up here as imported as new, followed by the name. That lets me know that this is a second part. So now all I have to do, I come back over to the assembly, and now I can actually add it into the assembly where I want it. So I come down here to insert, come to existing 3D part. It's going to pop up this little box, which is just waiting for me to select the part, and all I have to do is come over to this tab and click on the part. Now we can place it in space. Click anywhere, and now we have that second part. So now if I come back to the original part, and I'm just going to click on this pattern here, get that open, I can change it, hit OK, and now we have two different wheels here. Alright, just going to undo that change. Alright, and with that, we've covered saving our parts, we've covered splines, ribs, patterns, and inserting either children of existing parts that are dependent on that original part, or inserting copies, independent copies, into our model. Thanks.